It was a warm Friday evening when I decided to stop at a small neighborhood restaurant on my way home from work, mainly because I was too tired to cook anything for myself and wanted a quiet place where I could sit down, relax for a while, and enjoy a decent meal before heading back to my apartment. And the place I chose was one of those cozy local spots that many people in the area seemed to like because it had a welcoming atmosphere, friendly staff, and the kind of menu that offered simple comfort food rather than anything overly fancy. When I stepped inside the restaurant, the first thing I noticed was how busy it was for that time of evening, with nearly every table filled by people chatting with friends, families sharing meals, and couples enjoying a quiet dinner, while soft music played in the background and the warm glow of decorative lights gave the entire dining room a relaxed atmosphere that felt comfortable but also a little dim, especially compared to the bright lighting outside on the street. A host greeted me at the entrance and quickly led me to a small table near the side wall of the restaurant, which was fine with me because I usually prefer quieter corners where I can eat without feeling crowded by too much activity. And after placing the menu in front of me, he wished me a good evening before heading back toward the entrance to help the next group of customers waiting to be seated. As soon as I picked up the menu, I realized that the lighting at my particular table was noticeably darker than the rest of the dining area because the overhead light fixture above me appeared to be dimmer than the others in the room. And while the soft candle on the table created a nice atmosphere, it didn't provide enough light to clearly read the small printed descriptions of the dishes listed throughout the menu. At first, I tried to adjust the angle of the menu so the candlelight would shine directly onto the pages, but the text was still difficult to make out because the restaurant had chosen a decorative font style that looked attractive but wasn't particularly easy to read in low lighting, which meant I found myself squinting slightly while trying to figure out what each dish actually included. After struggling for a moment, I decided to use the simplest solution available by taking my phone out of my pocket and turning on the flashlight feature, carefully pointing the light downward toward the menu so that the beam illuminated the page without shining toward anyone else in the restaurant, which allowed me to clearly read the descriptions of the appetizers and main courses. Within seconds, I was quietly scanning through the menu and deciding what I might want to order, when I suddenly became aware of someone watching me from the next table. And when I glanced up, I saw a middle-aged woman sitting nearby who had stopped talking to the person across from her and was now staring directly at me with an expression that suggested she was not at all pleased with what she was seeing. For a moment, I assumed she might simply be distracted or curious about the light. So I returned my attention to the menu and continued reading. But only a few seconds later, she leaned slightly toward me and said in a sharp voice that carried across the small gap between our tables that I should turn that light off immediately because it was bothering her. I looked up again and politely explained that I was only using the flashlight for a moment so I could read the menu because the lighting at my table was very dim, and I even angled the phone a little lower so the light would be directed completely toward the paper instead of anywhere near her table, hoping that the small adjustment would solve the problem and allow both of us to continue our meals peacefully. Instead of accepting the explanation, she shook her head with clear irritation and said that people shouldn't be using flashlights in restaurants because it was distracting and rude, even though the light itself was small and focused directly on the menu rather than shining into anyone's eyes or across the room. Trying to keep the situation calm, I told her that I would only need another moment to finish reading the menu, and then I would turn the light off. But my attempt at reassurance seemed to make her even more annoyed because she immediately stood up from her chair and stepped closer to my table, repeating that I needed to stop using the flashlight right away. At that point, several nearby diners had begun to notice the conversation, and although most of them looked more confused than bothered by the light itself, the woman appeared determined to turn the situation into a larger issue, raising her voice slightly as she insisted that my phone light was disturbing the entire dining room even though no one else had said anything about it. I once again tried to explain calmly that the restaurant lighting was too dim for me to read the menu and that the flashlight was simply helping me see the text clearly. But before I could even finish my sentence, she reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and loudly announced that she was calling the police because I was creating a disturbance in the restaurant. At first, I honestly thought she was exaggerating out of frustration because the idea of calling the police over something as harmless as a phone flashlight seemed ridiculous. But as she began speaking into the phone and describing the situation to the dispatcher as if it were some kind of serious disruption, I realized she was completely serious about involving law enforcement over a Minor inconvenience. A few minutes later, the restaurant manager approached my table after hearing about the situation from one of the servers, and after listening carefully to both sides of the story, he calmly explained that there was no rule against briefly using a phone light to read a menu, especially when the lighting in that part of the dining room was clearly dimmer than usual, due to a fixture that had been malfunctioning earlier in the evening. Unfortunately, the woman continued insisting that my behavior was unacceptable and that the police needed to handle the situation. And not long after that, 2 officers entered the restaurant responding to the call, which caused several diners to pause their conversations and glance toward the entrance to see what was happening. When the officers approached our tables, the woman immediately pointed toward me and explained that I had been shining a flashlight around the restaurant and refusing to stop despite her repeated requests. But after the officers looked at my phone resting on the table beside the menu and then glanced around the softly lit dining area, they quickly understood that the situation involved nothing more than a small flashlight used to illuminate a menu in a dim corner of the room. After speaking briefly with the manager and confirming that there were no rules against using a phone light in that situation, the officers calmly explained to the woman that my actions were not illegal and certainly did not justify an emergency call, while the surrounding diners slowly returned their attention to their meals as the brief tension in the room faded away. By the time the officers finished clarifying everything, the woman's confident expression had turned noticeably uncomfortable, and although she tried to mutter something about how the light had bothered her, it was clear that the dramatic outcome she expected had not happened. While I quietly turned off my flashlight, placed my order with the server, and continued the rest of the evening with a mixture of disbelief and quiet amusement at how something as simple as using a small phone light to read a menu had somehow turned into a police visit in the middle of dinner.